Thank you, Danny, Matthew, for coming along and sharing your thoughts and crystal ball gazing about the impact, the wider impact that something like COVID-19 can have. Danny, you wrote about this week and talked about how the massive, catastrophic flu of 1918-19 actually perhaps didn't have as wide an influence as one might expect.
It's very interesting because there have been quite a lot of books about it, and some of them sort of say this is how it changed the world. And what struck me was how little it changed our political narrative. In other words, we talk about all the great events of that century, the Holocaust, obviously, and Mao and his great leap backwards, and Stalin and his purges and the famines, and we don't include in that what was unquestionably it was the biggest killer and unquestionably one of the great events of the century.
Almost forgotten. It's
almost forgotten. And so it led me
to... Was that because it was directly in the shadow of the war? That in a sense...
Yes. So it's true. So 100,000 American troops died in the First World War, and 40,000 of them were killed by the Spanish flu. So unquestionably, it sort of melded together. And when some of the earliest people died, it didn't quite create the fuss it would have done because so many other people were dying in the same hospitals. I think that is undoubtedly part of it. But part of it, my guess would be, is because it wasn't man-made, there is a sort of feeling it's just one of those things. It's sort of natural disaster, and it doesn't deserve its place in a political discussion, or in a sort of historical discussion of the great shapes that force the great forces that shape the century. So I was just interested in this as it relates to COVID-19 now. Obviously, it's very important to stress. At this point, we don't know whether COVID-19 is what Bill Gates talks about. He talks about the once-in-a-century pathogen. Is COVID-19 that? And we simply don't know. And at this point, it hasn't reached anywhere close to the levels of the Spanish flu. So we don't think people should start to panic or to make themselves to feel that definitely 100 million people will die as died in the Spanish flu. But I certainly think for the first time it will bring into the political narrative a thought. Well, actually, we talk about terrorism as a threat. We talk about nuclear proliferation as a threat. We sometimes talk about famine. But do we really think enough and talk enough about disease? And I suspect this event, even if it turns out to be at the very mild end of the possibilities, will change the political narrative.
Do you think that might be the case as well, Matthew?
Yeah, I think we need to think about, it's interesting to think about COVID-19 in terms of its political impacts, its economic impacts, and its social impacts. And we have to recognise that in doing that, there are two big variables that we don't know about. And the first is the extent. I think people are now coming to assume that it is going to become pretty endemic, that it will affect all parts of the country in a reasonably high proportion of people. But the second issue is how long it lasts. Because I think how people respond to something that goes on for 6 weeks is very different to how they respond to something if it feels like it's going on for 6 months.
There's evidence about this, isn't it? You've written about this, about how habits embed, how long it takes for habits to embed.
Yeah, so just to take one small example, psychologists say it takes 6 weeks to embed a habit. Right? So think about business travel. You've already got, and a second thing is that shifts normally occur because a number of factors combine. Now, when you think about business travel, you've already got costs, it's expensive. You've got climate and businesses wanting to say they're doing something in relation to climate, and you've got improvements in the technology of video conferencing. So you've got these three things there. COVID-19 could be the tipping point. It could be that over the next couple of months, as people give up business travel because of the virus, they develop a habit, and having developed that habit, having got used to business meetings online, having got used to meetings online, I think, well, why on earth would I go through all that jet lag, being away from my family and all of that? And that may be a shift that is never reversed.
And given how dependent airlines are on the front of the plane to make the whole thing viable, that's a massive cutback in airline travel for everybody, potentially, as a thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, it occurs because there were already a set of factors leading to this point. I think, you know, when COVID-19 makes things happen which are just to do with this, and there's nothing else driving it, then things will revert to normal afterwards. But there are certain areas of society where there was a kind of imminent tendency, for example, and I'm sure when we get on to talking about politics, this is the same. COVID-19 is not going to create a political set of attitudes that never existed, but it will reinforce. In America, for example, there has long been considerable worry and concern, Michael Lewis wrote a book about it, that the kind of capacity of the state has withered away, that the institutions are just not there to be able to deal with crisis. COVID-19 could take a point which people have been arguing for some time, which there has been some evidence for, and it could absolutely drive it home. It could lead to a fundamental shift in attitudes in America about the kinds of risks they're willing to take, which result from the rolling back of state capacity.
Well, I was very interested in the way that this might change the political debate. And actually, as it turned out, I think I missed something. In the comments underneath my column, people began to talk about Brexit. Now, they talk about Brexit under columns about anything, but this was particularly marked. And I thought that what they would talk about would be, do we have an internationalist approach to this? And that was what was in the column.
Open versus closed.
Or an open versus closed. It wasn't actually that sparked the row about Brexit. It was fear versus no fear. So lots of people who I either recognised from previous columns or who stated this, who were leavers or no dealers, were complaining that the elite newspapers and the government was creating a panic about something that wasn't actually dangerous, that the whole thing would pass over and wouldn't be a problem, whereas the alternative, the opposite people, and I suppose they included me in that, were saying, well, actually, this could be quite serious and have quite serious consequences. So that was the first echo of a debate that, as Matthew said, is already taking place about how much value to put on expert projection.
Well, experts, there's that word from
Yes.
The referendum campaign.
I mean, the important thing about expertise is that do not over-correlate for expert knowledge. You then become somebody who you have this knowledge. You don't want to be the idiot that picked it up only for it to be worthless. So you put more store on it than you ought. And that's something that experts do, and you know, it's what Dominic Cummings meant when he started talking about super forecasters. Philip Tetlock has been particularly strong against the author of Super Forecasters, and that is, I think, what Dominic Cummings means when he attacks journalists. So I think he thinks we over-correlate for our expert knowledge about politics.
Well, one of the...
Can I just pick up on this? I think this is fascinating. And we might refer to it as memes. That is to say, the process by which something happens, and there are various political narratives that kind of fight it out. And so, you know, Danny's recognised one, which is well, there's a meme here which already exists, a pre-existing meme. This is the point. This COVID takes things which existed already, and some of them grow as a consequence. So you already had a meme, and that meme was the experts are out to frighten you. You don't trust them. You know. But there are other memes. I mean, there's a meme which is if you're saying, well, we should not be frightened, which is, well, you know, what about we don't care for old people? You know, that any kind of complacency here reveals that we're an uncaring society that is in some ways kind of, you know, willing to tolerate a certain group of people being damaged as long as the rest of our lives are left in the same position. You will absolutely have a meme which is around, as I said in relation to America, about the state. If the economy starts to close down, you'll have memes that are around, well, you know, isn't it interesting, the economy is, we're all coming together now, we're all showing more compassion to each other, you know, isn't this prefiguring a kind of a world we've adapted to climate change, a no growth or low growth world where actually we seem to be happier now as a consequence of the actions we've had to take. So you'll see these kind of different memes playing themselves out over the next few weeks. It'll be interesting to see which ones win.
But one of the points that Dan is making there about the echoes of the referendum, this if the virus doesn't prove to be, and these are worst case scenarios that obviously catch our eye all the time, if it doesn't prove to be quite as virulent and destructive as some of the worst case scenarios suggest, there'll be an awful lot of people, echoes of the referendum, who say you really can't trust them.
The millennium bug.
So the second point about all the expert advice is it all suggests probabilities involved, and we simply don't know, and nobody says that we do know, because you can't know. There are lots of unknowns. For example, nobody really knows what the fatality rate is because of COVID-19, because nobody knows exactly how widespread it is in the places where they're calculating fatality, and then obviously some of the actions we take may alter the spread because we're reacting to it. So it may be that the very actions we take will reduce its impacts. You can't know that.
But the point that Matthew's making there about how certain narratives will thrive and some won't as we go through this episode, we are living in an age where the American president can go to the UN and say, I'm against globalism, and can use hoax and COVID-19 in the same sentence. Aren't the probabilities that this could play into the sort of nationalist narrative, and it's all about drawing up borders, the reaction? It feeds
I think
a phenomenon that's out there already.
I think that, if you look at national responses, they vary according to the intensity of it, and also they vary according to the capacity of the state. So China does look like it's the only country where the number of cases is in decline, and it was able to use its pretty strong apparatus and also a set of social norms and values, I think, in China, which allowed it to do that. But nevertheless, I'd say that broadly speaking, the responses of states have been on the same. They've been on the same spectrum, that is to say. But for some countries, very intensive; other countries, less intensive. But a largely pragmatic view. It would be interesting if any country, any leader, was to step outside of that. So if any country and leader was to say, "Well, no, actually, we're going to just say, look, let it rip. That's fine. I'm a libertarian. Look after yourself. We'll all be okay." That will have an interesting effect. That will affect these narratives, because then if one country does that, other people in other countries will go, well, we should do that as well.
And they'll be able to see whether it fails.
Yeah, and of course it's possible in the times that we live in that somebody may choose to use this in some kind of racist narrative, some kind of nationalist narrative. I suspect
Salvini's already nudged that direction.
Yeah, you'll see a bit of that. I would be surprised if that spread. There's not much sign, it seems to me, that the public themselves has an appetite to kind of weaponise.
Trump has this interesting dilemma. It'll be very interesting in the United States, because he runs as the anti-establishment candidate, as you say, putting the word hoax and COVID-19 all in the same paragraph, and yet he's the president, and people are going to look to him to provide leadership. And so he's, in the end, there'll be facts on the ground that will affect the political narrative, as well as the memes and as well as the way people think. And he'll have to hope that
this could be his Katrina moment. That will be his worry. Won't it?
It could. And one of the evidence, political science evidence about the impact of these natural disasters is actually preparation and prevention doesn't really help you politically. Obviously it's vital in policy terms, it doesn't really help you politically. But how you deal with it once it happens, that really is very important politically. And sometimes it doesn't even matter if it's your fault. If the economy gets weaker and people die, people will either find a narrative that blames it on the government, or they'll think something else was the cause of the way they feel and blame that on the government. One of the examples I use is in 1916 when Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election. There'd been some shark attacks in New Jersey, by coincidence, his state, the ones that are in the Jaws film, actually, and they didn't close the beaches, but had nothing to do with him, obviously. Yet, when you look at the results, you can see that he suffered in those areas specifically, which suggests that the people blame the government for natural disasters.
Do you know that guy who didn't close the beaches is someone Boris Johnson once cited as a bit of a hero of his? And inside government, Boris Johnson, I believe, was acting as a bit of a brake on the announcement that eventually came this week of the government's action plan. But he, inside government, until the end of last week, was acting as a brake, saying, well, we don't want to engender chaos. I'm not really sure about all of this.
Can I just go back? Because I don't want to miss that Danny said, which is that prevention doesn't really kind of register. I wonder that may change because of the fact that this is global and the data. So one thing that might, it seems to me, happen in a few weeks' time is people can have a kind of global league table of, the number of people, the number of deaths, and we'll start to reflect on what this tells you about nations.
How we organise ourselves, how much money we put into healthcare.
Yeah, so I think an international phenomenon where you can see that prevention in one country seems to work quite well and prevention in another country has worked much less well might mean that it actually has more political salience than it would if it just in one country.
Because there could come out on top.
Because the thing about prevention, the reason it doesn't have salience is because there isn't really a counterfactual. But here we do have counterfactuals because it's going on in so many other countries. And so people will say, well, why is it that 10% of the population here has got it, whereas only 4% of the population there has got it?
It's interesting I think that's completely correct. And I think it's interesting what you say about Boris Johnson. Before he became Prime Minister, I pointed out that a theme of all of his writing was all these regulations are a load of nonsense. And, 10-point plan, he set his sights all the way through Matthew's era, number 10, on 10-point plans and declarations and, global policy and that sort of thing. And every instinct of his would definitely have been, let's not panic with this. It would have been with the commenters under my article, let's not engender an undeserved panic about it. But in the end, like with Donald Trump, he is the Prime Minister and he has to take sensible steps to ensure that people, that we do our best to prevent this and to deal with the problem because I think it will be quite difficult to prevent. That's my own prediction.
This is in governing mode, not campaigning mode. And yes. I just wondered what you make of that so far, having watched him do that press conference, the production, the confidence building that he exudes or not.
My view with Boris Johnson always was that he would see, and relatively rapidly, that the sort of insouciance that suited his journalism isn't a governing strategy, that he is basically an executive mayor, and this sort of event actually rather suits his style. He can organise the government to do something of a sort of grand type, and so far I think the government's performance has been good, but it's very early at this point, and I think however good government's performance is, and ultimately I don't think that's a past political matter. I suspect it would be the case under any party. It'd be reasonably good, but however good it is, it's still going. If this does become the problem that one thinks it could be, but it might not be, but it could be, then no matter how good its preparations are, people will still be cross and resentful to the government, I suspect.
Well, I think so many elements of this interest. I mean, the first thing just to say is actually I'm not sure campaigning mode is the wrong mode to be in relation to COVID-19, because I think that we don't know what's happening. We need to try things out. We need to see what happens when we pull this lever, whether it's attached to something. I mean, it's much better for people to do things voluntarily than through compulsion. So let's try out voluntary measures, and only if people are ignoring them in a way that is dangerous would you want to move to the next level. So I think an agile approach is probably the right kind of attitude to it, and I think it's really about the test for government is whether it's got this kind of real-time capacity to see what's happening and to respond reasonably pragmatically as things unfold. But I think another interesting dimension of this is that it's such a kind of cliche that we don't trust government. It's a time like this. One of the things you see is actually we kind of do trust government.
Echoes of 2008.
So I did Moral Maze last night with Michael Portillo, and he was saying, look, isn't it great the British were not panicking, you're not wearing masks, we're not doing this. And I saw part of the reason that is we kind of trust the government. The government hasn't told us to do this stuff, so we're kind of getting on with it. So I actually think that at a time like this, it reveals that we do want government to take the lead. We broadly do trust government. But the other issue I think is important is that trust is absolutely vital here, at all levels of society, by the way. Whether it's trusting the doctor, trusting the NHS, trusting the government, trusting your neighbours maybe. And part of that trust is a willingness to kind of be open about the issues and the choices that we face. And at the heart of this is what the philosophers call the trolley problem. In this discussion, which is, on the one hand, you've got data that, as the data gets better, will tell you with increasing accuracy how many people are likely to die if the disease lets rip. So this is a relative certainty, yeah? Versus the the very uncertain issue of the wide consequences for the rest of society if the economy, for example, shrinks by 10%. So the reason I say it's the trolley problem is, in a sense, the trolley problem, you've got the train shooting down the track, it's going to kill 4 people, you're on the bridge, do you push the man over the bridge, kills the 1 man and saves the 4 lives? And it turns out that people don't always assume that you should push the 1 man over to save the 4 lives, because they feel that somehow deliberately killing somebody is different moral category to allowing something to happen. And there's a similar kind of element to this, which is, the 10,000 deaths you're going to have if you let the disease rip, versus the very much less tangible consequences for the poor and for everybody else of closing down our economy. Now, my view is simply that kind of dilemma needs to be discussed. It can't be something which technocrats decide in a kind of closed room. It's something that we have to openly discuss as a society.
And the government sort of nudged at that, didn't they, by talking about how one in 5 might not be in the workforce. More people can die in incidents like this from neglect, from the fact that there isn't an ambulance,
yes,
there isn't medical care there, than actually die of the virus.
Michael Marmot's report about health inequalities and austerity suggests really that. I didn't necessarily agree with his political conclusions, but it certainly suggests there's a relationship between number of people who die and economic indicators. So anybody who believes that will believe that Matthew's correct.
So the classic example here, which Danny will remember, is the Southall train crash. So after the Southall train crash, we closed the trains down. But there's no trains really, city trains for several weeks, because we were trying to work out what had gone wrong. In that time, of course, road fatalities went up by, I don't know what it was, but when 200 more people died on the roads, when there was absolutely no question that 200 people would have died on the railways. But in a sense, that was because there was a concrete risk, which was something went wrong with the trains we didn't know quite why, and it might happen again, versus 200 car deaths all around the country, none of which you could absolutely.
And I suspect that more people, by the way, will travel in their cars because they don't want to travel on public transport, and that will have exactly that effect.
And do you think people really want to be engaged in that philosophical debate, or to franchise it out to government?
Whether or not they want to be involved in the debate, I think they want if the debate is happening in a democracy, we need the public to understand the debate is happening.
Those that want to see it should be able to.
And a real look, for me, one of the big tests of politicians is a willingness to be honest about dilemmas. And at a time like this, there is a kind of Chinese way of doing things, which is to say there is only one right thing and we're going to do it and you're going to follow us. And there's a democratic way of doing things, which is say there's a genuine dilemma here. We've faced difficult choices. We're deciding to opt for this. And by the way, if it doesn't work out, we'll try something else.
I know, but the problem with the analogy, in the trolley analogy, all the people were other people. Right. The problem with this is that's not true. In this case, it's the choice between the probability that economic reduction in activity might kill someone else versus the possibility that this might kill you or somebody that you know in your family. So I think ultimately you're right in thinking that is the trolley problem is exactly what we're discussing. You're also right that we should discuss it, but I suspect that it will be resolved by that, right? Which is that people will both expect and will personally take actions that lead them to reduce their chances of death. Although sometimes I think people will be a bit careless about it, so they'll self-isolate, but they won't do it very well. They'll use it to call the electrician, because they happen to be home at the time. Otherwise, they won't logically sit through. But it will definitely reduce the spread.
I do think one thing is going to be interesting about this. Let's assume that it does reach epidemic proportions, and that is what it will teach us about our economy. So I think economies are like relationships. You only really find out their true nature when they're going through hard times. And there are certain characteristics of our economy which have only really existed in relatively good times, the classic being the gig economy. The gig economy's growth has entirely been in a period of relatively benign economic circumstances and a relatively tight labour market. If you get into a situation of economic slowdown, all these people who have no means of support if they're not getting any work, who are reliant on platforms who will have enormous power now because they'll have far too many drivers and far too few jobs. So,
dreamy for them in some cases.
Well, what will they do with their prices, etc. So the gig economy is the kind of classic example of something we're going to find out a lot more about if this reaches epidemic proportions, because we've never seen it under those circumstances. More broadly, the fact that we have a service sector economy means that in some ways this is, I think, would have a bigger impact, because if you're, in manufacturing, and you close down for a month, there's a cash flow issue, but you'll get rid of the inventory in time. People will need to consume this. If you run a restaurant and it closes for 4 weeks, people don't have 2 meals at the end of the 4 weeks. And a huge number of service businesses have very, very tight margins. Finally, in this kind of economy area, the level of personal debt that people have, the RSA's done work on this, a remarkably high proportion of people say that they are just kind of £150 away from economic disaster. So, we will learn quite a lot about the strengths and weaknesses of our economy if we do go into a sustained period of kind of economic shutdown.
A related point perhaps, but interdependency, supply lines and the rest of it, there's already lots of speculation that kind of economy that has developed in the globalized world will come up for question. Do you see that happening?
I think
self-sufficiency.
Yeah, I think there will be a debate about it. I think all sorts of debates, and I think weirdly, food will be part of it because there'll be a question about food standards, where we get food from, whether we're entitled to impose our food standards on other countries and other countries on us, which is, Matthew said, is a pre-existing debate. It's very interesting the number of people who have commented about chlorinated chicken under a column about COVID-19. There's definitely going to be an issue about whether, China's sovereignty over its own wet markets is something that the rest of the world is willing to live by, and if it isn't, what we would do about it. So I think these questions are the question of whether there is, it came up with Ebola as well, whether there is an international minimum that countries are required to do by law, whether that legal requirement falls on individuals or on states. All those things, I think, will be the subject of renewed debate, because the truth is, in a global market economy, though there are always going to be those political rows are going to come up, and interestingly, I think they've come up so far in the form of tariffs, the role of the World Trade Organization, the role of the European Union, but they might be much more powerful and much more immediate and more sort of personally felt when they come up in on the question of people's survival.
What do you think, Matthew? Do we roll back to does globalization roll back in any sense at the end of all of this? Maybe over years to come, nothing instant, of course. If it were to be as big as predicted. And to go back to what I said earlier, it's not just the scale, but it's also the time scale. That's, if it goes on for months, if there is a new normal, the question is that new normal one that is deeply painful to us and therefore reminds us of actually how much we rely on global supply chains because we're missing our avocados or whatever, and actually in some ways it might reverse that. And what's been going on, people go, oh my goodness, I want to be part of a globally interdependent world because it's been pretty miserable not being part of it. Or the reverse, which is people get used to it. And they think, well, actually, I've not had an avocado for 2 months. Life's okay. Maybe I can, survive on English, fruit and vegetables. And there is a kind of, there is out there narratives around, as I said, around kind of how we need to live in a lower growth environment. How might be local food. There'll be a kind of rise in communitarianism, I think, associated with this. But not necessarily internationalism, because another way of looking at it is the only way we get over things like this is by sharing information and expertise and the rest of it.
So, yeah, but I think you'll get that in the you think you'll get that? I don't think, Danny might correct me on this, but I don't think the kind of push against globalization has really happened in the scientific community. I think they've continued to work very effectively, and I think that will happen. So we'll have the economy may become deglobalized, politics may become deglobalized. Hopefully, it would be really problematic if the scientific community did that.
I'm sure that won't happen. I'm sure there'll be, but it does raise, one way, obviously, of dealing with the problem of food coming from other places or viruses coming from other places that might contaminate this country is you don't take them, and another way of dealing with it is you try and help or assist to make sure that doesn't happen to those goods and services and people. But that obviously involves a degree of international interdependence. And I think that will be a debate. I thought that debate might even start in Britain already, and one of the reasons it hasn't is because the same people, I think, who might take more of a nativist view are at the moment taking the view, I can't believe the media and the elites are panicking us about something that's not really going to happen. We're British and we can overcome this. And therefore they're not turning to that issue. That may then happen. We may get that debate, but so far that debate, which I did anticipate would be the first one, is not the first one in line. The first one in line is this project fear?
There's another factor in all of this, because we were touched on the economic hit that inevitably comes if things are as bad as they could be. That masks perhaps other hits that are happening to the economy, whether it's Brexit or anything else. You can keep pointing at this, can't you? It's not good, but it's a get out of jail card.
What happens? The Johnson government got elected. We're now in danger of having what the no deal that everyone has talked about. Different no deal, obviously, but the no deal, and the supermarket shelves are empty. Exactly what everyone said will happen, but it obviously didn't happen for that reason. But there are definitely continuities in the debate.
As I think we've been saying throughout, the reality is that what COVID-19 does is it overlays a set of existing narratives which we're fighting it out. And, on this internationalism issue, there are both the narratives. So there are one which is, why on earth are we cutting ourselves off from the world? I did a really kind of silly tweet right at the beginning of this saying, why does COVID-19 not realise we're now a sovereign nation? So you've got all of that kind of isn't it ridiculous, this whole kind of nationalist mood, when clearly a problem like this, like so many other problems, is global in its nature. On the other hand, you get, well, look, we're cooperating with, Boris Johnson leaning out to Macron. We're perfectly able to cooperate pragmatically when there's a crisis. We don't need Brussels and all that bureaucracy. Nations will just work together when they need to work together. So both of these narratives will fight it out.
That's true, but it brings up something that I think is an acute question, and was at the heart of Brexit. The heart of Brexit wasn't, do we cooperate with France? It is, do the French have any stake in our domestic law? And what this raises is that there are certain things which, if countries don't do, they cause this sort of problem. That's why disease is a bit different, I think. So what the Chinese do in terms of regulating the use of their animals, it was definitely, by the way, ducks were involved in the Spanish flu, or at least people think that they were. In other words, living with all the animals right in the trenches and all those sort of things. That was thought to have possibly been involved in it, and exactly the same thing is said to be the case with COVID-19, and that means, do we have a legitimate interest in Chinese domestic farming policy? And that's where the sovereignty issue comes.
I think that's a second wave thing, personally, in the sense that I think people, we will pragmatically respond to where we are. We don't know much about it. If and when this dies down, and people say, as Danny said earlier, we need to start treating pandemics and disease in the same way as we treat terrorism or whatever else, that's where I think people will look at the rules, and they'll say, okay, what should the rules now be? If something breaks out in one country, what is the responsibility of that country? And should we globally be saying to that country, look, I'm sorry, you as a country will have to close yourself down. Maybe the international community will commit to supporting you financially as you go through that. So I think that we will have to consider, there's going to be a whole new set of kind of academic studies and political conversations about how it is you respond to pandemic now being at the forefront of our minds.
Probabilistically, though, this is definitely a bigger threat than terrorism. So the maths of terrorism have always been that there's small numbers of people who probably would kill small numbers of people, but there's always the possibility that if you don't deal with the small numbers of people who get killed, that you'd end up getting a massive tragedy or disaster caused by it. The maths with diseases are much clearer. It's obvious that you would do, and therefore... But
the psychological connection is not always as strong.
And that's exactly the point I made about Spanish flu. Less people were killed in the First World War in combat but do we have a 9-part series on the Spanish flu? No. Or does an Australian, New Zealand film director colorise a film about the Spanish flu? Do we have Spanish flu Armistice Day? No. So because it's not the same thing as far as we think. Well, I think this may alter our perceptions. Look, I mean, the evidence against me is the Spanish flu happened and it didn't. But maybe this will.
It always puts me in mind of a wonderful New Yorker cartoon of people walking along Broadway, and in the background there, on the Empire State Building, there's an enormous rabbit clawing planes out of the sky. But the people are just walking along, and one is saying to the other, of course, if it was a gorilla, people could take it seriously. This question of how we respond to risks, we aren't calculating machines.
Matthew, Danny, thank you for responding to the invitation. Thank you for being here. Very grateful for your thoughts.